first book, I think, and based on his dissertation that he already did do, to his last one, Missionaries, Converts, and Rabbis, that goes to the 19th century. And this passion of continuous research is so rare for someone who at the same time was a director and initiator of so many projects and so many groups and so many topics that occupy us until today. Therefore, besides these studies, one should mention, I think, in this forum, for us, because it's in the introduction for us to think about the project through his eyes, his introductions to some volumes. Mainly, I think, essential papers of Jewish culture in Renaissance and Baroque, preachers of the Italian ghetto, or cultural intermediaries, all reflect in each one of them. He summarized, he gathered many people who worked on topics that were not discussed as such before, and opened new dimensions to the issue. And of course, we should mention his panoramic books that will continue to occupy us. Jewish thought and scientific and scientific science and scientific work. I don't remember the exact title. Or early modern Jewry that was published a decade ago. One can disagree with David. I think generations will continue to disagree with David because he is a paradigmatic author. So we continue to disagree with him and to learn through disagreement and acknowledging our deep depth to his thought. At the same time, I must confess, while reading his last book in the last week, we will continue to rethink, I think, or at least I will talk to myself. I will have to continue rethink my own conclusions and observations according to David Ruderman. I read his last book also as a critique of a line that I tried to develop, although not, it doesn't, I did not directly, but that was my observation. It will continue it continues to disturb us, to go back with early studies, and you see the things that he wrote 30, 40 years ago are still innovative as they are. One thing I would like to mention about David is the fact that he wrote his dissertation at the Hebrew University. Something that cannot be thought even today. One cannot think it's not reasonable that someone from the United States will come to study early modern history at the Hebrew University. He is American, but he came to Jerusalem because I think it's very. I think about it also because of what I think the Americanization of Jewish studies in Hebrew in the last decade. He came here. From here, he raised general questions, not the questions that occupied American historians of Jewish culture and of Jewish history. He brought it to the United States. He established such institute that remains the most important center of Jewish studies, I think, even after he left. But he came to Jerusalem in order to subvert the main assumptions of what we call the Jerusalemite school. The autonomy of Jewish history, of course, for David, Jewish history is part of the context. It can study Jewish history, but within the general question. And the very definition of modernity that as it started at the late 18th, 19th century, and the internalization of the understanding of early modern, although in a controversial way, for any discussion of Jewish history. So indeed, I don't think so. For me, it seems that the successor of David Ruderman is indeed Edelstein, both someone who integrates great scholarship with initiatives like this project. And I think that there is no better discussant for this project than David Ruderman. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nono. Now that we introduced both parties, let's start off our discussion. We have prepared some questions for Professor Ruderman, which raise themes common both to our work in JEWTACT and Professor Ruderman's many published works. A subject very central in both, of course, is translation. So, Iris, if you can start us off by presenting this point, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? I'm connected through another. Okay, yes. Great.
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank Nono for that introduction. It was very touching. And I wanted to ask David. Translation has long played a central role in your corpus of studies already. In your first book on Abraham Farisol, you showed how Farisol employed the works of Montalbano in his Igeret Orchot Olam. Later in Kabbalah, Magic and Science, you started to kind of trace the contours of Yagel's intense preoccupation with translation, and other works have revealed further translations by Yagel. In Jewish Enlightenment in an English Key, you worked on the translations of Avraham van Oven and Abraham Tang, and more recent work has revealed the role played by translation in the works of Christian Hebraists, missionaries, converts like Stanislaus Hoga and Solomon Yom Tov Bennett and others. But you've never actually, I mean, taken together, all of these works kind of show how pivotal translation was for the relationships between Christians and Jews in the early modern period. But you've never actually reflected on translation as a distinct cultural phenomenon in Judaism. And what I wanted to do today was to invite you to kind of reflect on the role that translation has played in your corpus of works, and to ask why you think translation has been so pivotal, such a recurring motif in your work, in a way that has really, like Nono said, paved the way to our own project.
Professor Ruderman, we can't hear you. Thank you.
Okay, now you hear me?
Yeah.
And you can see me, and can I make my picture bigger, or what should I do here?
I think it's fine like this.
Okay, fine. Okay, first of all, I would have been happy, Diane, if Nono would have finished and I could then leave. I mean, that was just, you know, very few of us have opportunities of having a hespedim while we're still alive. So thank you, Nono. I love you, and I would kiss you if I was there. But Iris, thank you. רציתי לדבר עברית גם כן, אבל לפחות מתנצל שאני מבקש מכם לתרגם מהמוח העברי שלהם לאנגלית, אבל אולי זה מתאים ב-JEWTACT. אבל חשבתי שידי צריכה להיות עליי עליונה, אם מדבר אנגלית, אני יכול לנצח על אהוביה, אם הוא שואל שאלה מאוד קשה. אז בגלל זה אני עברתי לאנגליה. אני מבקש סליחה, אולי פעם אחת נעשה את זה בעברית. So if you want to ask questions in Hebrew or anything else, I don't care. I can understand you, obviously, but I'm just lazy and old, so English is easier. Iris, thank you for your question. So the first answer is the reason I didn't think self-consciously as much as you do about translations is because when I started, you weren't born. And without you, you know, we wouldn't have, who thought of it that seriously, except for this group of people in Tel Aviv, Gidon Turi and all of those people who I found opaque. I couldn't understand what they were doing. I found their understanding of modern Jewish history rather narrow and limited to the 18th, 19th century, but that's an old story. And of course, Turi himself, as you point out so well, totally missed the early modern period. He didn't find translations in the early modern period, which seems rather hard. I mean, even the ones that are mentioned, the ones that are hidden, of course, are harder to find. So you have something to do with that, and that underscores your revolutionary role with your wonderful colleagues. But let me answer it in two other ways. First of all, I think we need to contextualize where I began in terms of my study. I don't know if you accepted any of what Nona was saying. He was exaggerating completely. But the question that I came to Israel in the 1970s to work on the Renaissance, but there wasn't anyone here that was an historian of the Renaissance. You recall, although Bonfield is older than I am, he was still a graduate student. And Edel was like a young, he had graduated college and he was even younger, even though he was still meeting me and talking about Kabbalah in those years. So I worked with Beinard and Ben Sasson, one of them a historian of the Inquisition, and the other one a student of Eastern Europe. I sort of was on my own path. The real question that I dealt with, and the title of that book, whether there's such a thing as a Renaissance Jew, was what were Jews doing in the Renaissance? Or to paraphrase Joan Kelly, was there a place for women in the Renaissance? Was there a place for Jews in the Renaissance? That was, in other words, there were some basic questions that had to be addressed that came long before the question of translation. Not even the question of periodization of early modern Jewry. That was a question that came up later on as we changed the vocabulary. Then it was simply, is there a Renaissance? And this was about Italian Jews. And what were they doing and how they were affected? I mentioned at that time a young man named Arthur Leslie. He wrote his dissertation at Berkeley on Yochanan Alimano. And he was very bright, but he could never write anything. There is an article published by him in my essential papers that Nono mentioned. But I remember rooming with him at the AJS meetings in the 70s and 80s, and we would stay up all night arguing, do the Jews have a Renaissance? I mean, it was unbelievable. I never got any sleep staying there, but I learned a lot about the Renaissance. And that really was the whole question. Now, when I published Farisol, by this time my partner in dialogue, or in disputation was probably more accurate, was Reuven Bonfield. And Bonfield, when I first published my first book, he said, we have another Cecil Roth with footnotes. And that, of course, was the ultimate put down. That generated my article against him and, in defense of Cecil Roth. I don't know if you ever seen that article. And he continued to talk to me after that, which I wasn't sure of, because there were people that didn't like Reuven at the time who were very pleased that I had broken with my dear friend. But I didn't break. I just wanted to get him angry and start another conversation with him. But the point is that clearly he understood this period differently. And by the 1980s, he came out with an article which is very important in Iresa's new book, in arguing essentially that it was the ghetto period where Jewish creativity emerged and not the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period of great oppression and great difficulties for Jews, and Jews were not affected by the larger culture except for a very small elite group. And therefore, the Renaissance wasn't a period of interaction and cultural exchange, but it was the ghetto. What emerged out of this was a kind of historiographical debate. And even to the point where Michael Brenner, in his German version of his book on historiography, has a page and a half about the Ruderman-Bonfield debate. it's great. I mean, I love to be put in print and put side by side with Bonfil. I didn't deserve it. And I came out as the Yehudi Galuti, and he was the big Zionist. He was continuing through the traditions of the Jerusalem school, and I was the Galuti Jew who identified with Cecil Roth and saw everything wonderful and blue skies and Jews and Christians drinking and going to the same prostitutes and all of that. That was all, you know, and dance teachers and all of those things going on and so on. But Reuven also was making another point that Jews, and this, by the way, addresses a question that will come up later. I don't want to be repetitive, but in the period of the ghetto, Jews create, because the ghetto creates a certain familiarity, a certain naturalness. In other words, whatever else the ghetto is, it's not expulsion. And whatever else the ghetto is, it provides a kind of common space where Jews and Christians hang out with each other. So that while there's still hostility, there's also a naturalness, a familiarity, which creates Jews become more Italian in the context of the ghetto. In other words, separation makes them more familiar with their own surroundings, and they begin to write more in Italian, for example, which is a critical thing when we speak about languages. So what he's also saying, I think, I mean, I don't know if he actually said this explicitly, is that Jews in their own state, in their own space. In other words, this was a kind of Zionist reading of Jewish history for the 16th, 17th century. The ghetto creates Jewish creativity in Italy, not the Renaissance, and therefore the separation. In any case, these were the debates that were going on when I began the 70s and 80s, and therefore marking these out and debating them and trying to understand them, and therefore trying to excavate all these different thinkers that no one had worked on. I mean, you know, not only Parasol and Yagel, but a whole group of others that had been ignored. Some of them still not fully studied. Remember, when I began to write, the literature on Italian Jewry was Simonson, Carpi, Toaf, and then there was, of course, Roth and Schulvas. You know, Schulvas and their understanding of Burckhardt, and they were living in another world. But these other guys were social historians that they cataloged all of these Jewish thinkers, but they didn't really address them or think about them in terms of what was going on in the larger world. In other words, intellectual history of the Italian Renaissance was something that was not developed. Now, that leads me to my second point, and I am going to answer you. You're saying to yourself, why am I drifting off here into the 17th century? And one of the things I also, I don't know, I missed, it's there, but I missed it in your book. I came to translation out of intellectual history. That to me was the obvious bridge. I was interested in finding out what these Jews read, how their intellectual context expanded their horizons, how they contributed to the larger culture around them, what they were reading, what they were citing. Citation led to translation. Now, that seems so obvious, you don't have to mention it, but you didn't mention it, and not directly. And it seemed to me that I didn't need to go read translation studies to appreciate the fact that one was leading to the other. And the question is, what is a translation versus a citation? If a guy quotes a line or two, is that a translation? I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with that in JEWTACT and so on. But to me, it was a very interesting question. I mean, what do you do, for example? Yes, Azaria de Rossi translates a whole text, right? But Azaria de Rossi on one page quotes 20 different people. So what do you do with that? Are those translations? No, they're not translations. They're intellectual citations. What do you do with a work like Kisot Levet David in Italy? He's one of the first to use footnotes. Isn't footnote a stage in the process of translation, or does that lead one step to the other? So what I'm trying to say is that my interest in translation came out of my interest in intellectual history. And what I was doing was trying to find bridges. The contrast is not between that and personal encounter. I don't buy that personal encounters created friendships, as Daniel Yuta once argued in a kind of, for me, a silly article. I was the only reader that said it shouldn't be published, but it was published anyway. I mean, he's a smart guy. I love him, but the friendship in the Renaissance, I don't know if there's friendship. Jews are always a minority, and they're always beleaguered, and this I buy from Bunfield, etc. But they were indebted to this larger culture, and I absorbed that through my study of reading them and their text. Some of them quoted more extensively, some of them began to quote entire texts, and that leads to translation. So therefore, for me, translation is an extension of intellectual history. And primarily, it's other things as well, and obviously you can learn a great deal, as I learned from you, from reading you, about the theory of translation and translation studies, and the colonialism and so on, all of that translation involves. But I didn't need to read that literature to understand that some translations are hidden and some of them are not hidden. Some of them are quite explicit, or some of them quote and then both hide and quote at the same time. But it seemed to me it came out naturally, so that's why I sort of stumbled on this. I wasn't looking for a translation in the Igeret Orchot Olam, but I discovered, to my not so great surprise, that indeed he was getting his sources from somewhere else, and that he just liberally communicated that. So I guess that would be my answer. It's not a very sophisticated answer, but it's why it was so important to me, or why translations became an important part of my work. And what you have done is taken it to this self-conscious level and moved us to really think about it in a much more serious way. And the other thing I would say is that my interest was exclusively in Hebrew. When you add Yiddish to the mix, it really changes. In other words, that was also striking in your book. That as soon as you introduce all of the Yiddish literature with its own issues and its striking translation activity, the picture becomes much more complicated and much more interesting. And that's the brilliance of doing them side by side. And of course, if you add, Ladino and the other languages, as you are doing slowly, that becomes a much more complicated process. Now, I hope you said I could talk about Yom Tov Bennett, but I don't know if it fits here. Should I wait to get that in later on?
Yeah, I thought it could be, if we would have discussed more books, so maybe it would fit in as the last brick, but maybe we'll come back to that later, I think.
Okay, we'll come back to that later. Okay, because that's another example of translation that is totally weird, and I need your help on that. Yeah, okay, all right. Anyway, that's a start of an answer. I mean, that was a great question, so I did the best I could with it.
Okay, so as you're saying, we saw that it's very difficult to discuss Italian Jewish thinkers without thinking about these questions of Jewish Renaissance, openness, closeness, and relations with Christians, and maybe Jewish suffering vis-a-vis Jewish flourishing. Magdalena, would you like to weigh in here?
That's question number 3, right, Magdalena?
Yeah. Sorry, my apologies. The very moment Ahuvia said my word, I couldn't hear things. So here I am.
Sorry.
And yes, so you already started actually discussing some of the things. Yes, that are very much, indeed John Kelly inspired. So did Jews have a renaissance? And I want to take it to the history, perhaps even more of a social history of medicine and Jews, who so prominently feature in some of your most marvelous, from my perspective, most marvelous work that you produced. So as you know, the recent scholarship actually called for another critical revision of the social and cultural place of Jews in the Italian Renaissance. So while, as you've been describing, why the notions of connectivity and exchange and cross-fertilization were so important in this earlier phase of building the history of the Jewish and Christian relationships during Italian Renaissance, more recent studies written by historians such as Tamar Herzig, Emily Michelson, and many others emphasize the violence and brutality which affected the lives of Italian Jews. Forced conversions, expulsions, ghettoizations, economic restrictions, they brought
new forms of control over Jewish communities and individuals. And these, of course, affected also Jewish physicians. All the new restrictions concerning Jews treating Christians were enforced. And of course, the medical service was increasingly limited to the populations in the ghetto, but also other medical activities were becoming gradually illicit. Well, of course, Inquisition, this was specifically targeting new Christians and Jewish physicians such as Amato Lusitano and Eliyahu Montaldo. So, and yet the history of medicine and the Jews still primarily speaks about this like new intellectual horizons that Jewish physicians experience in this particular period. Open universities, publishing, reading, becoming familiar with new theories and practices. So my question actually is how we as historians interested in medicine can navigate the tensions between the worsening social and economic grounds for medical practice and the greater openness for the recognition of Jewish medical and epistemic expertise.
Got it. Okay, that's thank you so much for that question. First of all, as I started to intimate in my first response, it's not such a new question. In other words, again, I don't want to invoke my friend Brunfield too much here. He'll get a swelled head. But his work, he has a work called The Jews in the Renaissance, which is not his greatest work. I mean, his greatest work was his work on the Rabbanut, and then some of his brilliant essays. But for him, the Renaissance is Bernardino di Siena, is Antonio of Firenze. It is about missionary sermons. It is about the Jew as a prostitute. And you recall how he uses that metaphor. Everybody hates her, but they can't do without her. She's a necessary part of society. And he develops this theme quite explicitly at the beginning of the book. And he goes on to describe the horrific conditions under which Jews lived in the 15th, 16th century. So part of our debate was clearly, is it blue skies or cloudy skies? So that is old. And it seems to me, I mean, I love Tamar's book, and I haven't read Mickelson, but I gather she deals also with sermons and so on. It's not a totally new story whatsoever. And of course, the Inquisition and all of that part is very much a part of our stories. With respect to doctors, there again, it depends on how you look at this period from the perspective of development and growth. Clearly, Padua, was opened up a door in a way that no other university opened up a door. At the same time, they were using the bodies of Jews for all of the nituchim, and there were horrible conditions that Jews faced, and it was very difficult to be a student. And that was the best of all places. The same goes on in Leuven and other places where Jews were first introduced to the university, and of course, many universities wouldn't take Jews. There's a chapter in the book that some people don't like, my science book on the conversos, where there I do argue about race, and I talk about racial prejudice, and particularly in the city of Hamburg, an enormous debate breaks out between Jewish and Christian doctors, the tension between Paracelsus and his attitude towards Jews and so on. So there is a lot there. And I also talk about how Jews essentially turn their victimhood, I'm speaking about Jewish doctors, into a badge of honor. So that we have all these books written about Jewish doctors and about the history of Jewish doctors and about the great honor of being a Jewish doctor, etc. And a certain arrogance even about the Jewish doctor, who is the great practitioner and so on. I guess what you're asking is not just about doctors, it's about the entire early modern period. How do we interpret an early modern period where prejudice and openness exist side by side? Jews are never really befriended, as I said earlier. They're tolerated, and their literature is exploited for Christian purposes. You could argue that Pico is really a friend of Alimano and so on, but is he really? I mean, it's a power relationship that's going on there entirely. So, in other words, what you're asking is really a fundamental question. What do you choose to emphasize, and what do you choose? Kenny Stowe was another one from the 70s that was clearly pointing out the extravagances of the church in the Counter-Reformation long before this new literature. So what I'm saying is, there are nuances, and this literature is really exciting and important, but it's not necessarily that different from what existed in the past. We have to deal with these contradictions, and maybe Brunfield is right that within the ghetto space, even Jewish doctors that have to spend all of their time dealing primarily with Jewish patients are still speaking to a larger audience, are still somehow transcending or moving around Europe in a kind of transnational way, which opens up all kinds of possibilities as well as limitations. But I guess the balance we have to get correct. And I think in pointing this out, I would agree with you. Everything wasn't wonderful. And by the way, I didn't accept the fact that I'm Brunfield, that I'm Cecil Roth. I did once give the Cecil Roth lecture and went overboard, praising him because his family was sitting in the first row in London. But no, I'm not Cecil Roth. But I do again, what I did in that article was to talk about what Cecil Roth was doing in the 30s when he was writing these books, and how the context was so damn different. To appreciate what he did is to see him in a certain sense as heroic. But he exaggerated. He was looking for positive elements in Jewish, and his way of dealing with was writing a book like that, which influenced this 15-year-old Reformed Jewish kid sitting in New York at the time, a Reformed rabbi's son. I'm a Reformed rabbi, but I'm also a Reformed rabbi's son. And that was the first book I ever read in Jewish history. So I was labeled. At the same time, I've learned a lot, and the world is as dark and as light as we want to see it. It's not very different than our world. I mean, I really wonder. I better stop right now, but I wonder how so many other institutions are going to survive in the world that we now live in, particularly universities and the kind of history world of the mind that we live in. We do so under duress, and we will do so under always the pressure that we are irrelevant and that we do damage to young people and training them in the way we think about the world. That's certainly happening in the United States of America, to my amazement. But nevertheless, we pursue and we still do good history. And, from Mark Bloch on and so many other great historians, that didn't slow them down, and the great doctors continue to thrive and do their work as well under very difficult conditions. But your question is welcome and important.
Okay, so maybe let's go on a bit further about Jewish medicine, because I think it's very. I mean, JEWTACT and your books mention it so much. Tamar, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, so throughout your books and articles on Jews and medicine, you've revealed the threads which constantly tied medicine with Jewish culture and identity in the early modern period, stating, for instance, that medicine and healing were at the core of Jewish culture and identity. And as an historian who had been focusing primarily on the history of Christian medicine before turning the focus to Jewish medicine, I would like to know whether you think this relationship between medicine and Jewish culture and identity is substantially different and distinct from the one that was nurtured in Christian society during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the early modern period. I'm talking primarily about notions such as healing, Jesus the healer, and the whole concept of healing, which is foundational in thought. And how do you distinguish between these two cultures, which are both religious and cultures of healing?
Okay, I'm going to. That's a great question, Tamar. Thank you. And it does reflect your bio, which I did read. I want to broaden the question a little more and introduce you to a debate which is very brief, but nevertheless very important to me in the Jewish science book. Is an exchange between me and Amos Finkelstein. And you know Amos Finkelstein's book. To my great trepidation, Amos Finkelstein was the reader of my Yagel book for Harvard. And when I could identify it immediately because every other line was either German or Latin. That that's the way he writes in familiar prose. At first I had to sit there and understand what he was talking about. Then in one of his essays that came out soon after, that was published in his collection, he talks about the fact that Jews had no intrinsic interest in nature and no particular skills at medicine or science. I think more science, he used the word, than medicine, but I'm sort of conflating the two here to make my point. I argued, it was mostly in the conclusion of my book on Jewish science, that's wrong, and that indeed there is something within the Jewish tradition that helped to shape a long relationship. You were frozen. Okay, I was looking at a frozen Tamar. Now you're okay. It's weird to talk to a frozen person. Anyway, I argued, and in fact, I began to write an appendix to the book, which came out about the study of nature in antiquity, which I didn't know anything about, but I had to lay out an argument that this is an old obsession, that there is something intrinsic within the Jewish tradition that encourages medical activity among Jews, and that God doesn't just require healing on his own, but requires human beings to participate in this covenantal relationship of healing themselves and so on. And this goes straight through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period and elevates. Of course, there's also an economic and a social dimension to this. The only way Jews could enter the scientific community was through medicine. Medicine was the only way. So that's why I was a reader for Maoz's recent book, and he was conflating the mathematical sciences with the biological sciences. I was arguing that indeed it was mostly the biological sciences that Jews were involved with because of their medical training, whether they went formally to the university or not. The biological sciences was the only way that they could get in. There was no other way of entering into scientific societies or being a part of the larger culture of science that emerged in the early modern period. So that for professional and economic and social political reasons, Jews were limited in terms of their exposure to science, but not because of any kind of intrinsic value within their tradition. The values were there, and the values of healing and so on. I'm not comparing whether Christians don't have these values also. I think they do. But it seems to me that there's such a long pedigree of the place of the healer within Judaism that it was natural, and it made sense, and of course, economically and politically, Jews used medicine as a way of connecting to the larger society. It also became a means of them creating their own social, intellectual networks across Europe. In other words, there's something transnational about this, which I felt. I compared, I remember the late, what's his name? The political thinker in Jerusalem, who we were having these long talks about science and politics in the 80s. He unfortunately died of cancer. Who am I talking about, Iris? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I began thinking about scientific societies and whether, in fact, Jews were creating a kind of scientific society. Whether there was a linkage, certainly among the converso physicians there was, and they saw themselves as a group. But even beyond, the graduates of Padua, for example, and what they were doing in terms of linkages. So their cultural identity became part of their professional identity. To be a doctor was not simply to be a doctor, was also to be a Jew doing a Jewish thing. So anyway, that's how I approached that subject. That isn't exactly what you were asking, I know, but that question was really quite important to me. And taking on the great Amos Funkenstein, I don't know if I succeeded, but at least I felt I had to respond to him. He, of course, ignored me as he usually did, but that's okay. Anyway, that's a stab at your question. I'm sure there's more to talk about, but that's let me stop at that point. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Ruderman, can I add a follow-up question to this?
You were the leader. I do what you tell me.
Okay, so I'm going to add a follow-up question to this and say that I think what we're now revealing in the project, and some materials I showed you and materials that will be available in the database, and it's also related to Iris and Magdalena's paper about science in Yiddish, science translations from Latin into Yiddish, that is going to be out soon, I think. I think what we now revealed that there was a lot of translations, or more translations than we used to think, that are not connected to the medical sciences, but to more general subjects. So maybe I would like to ask if you can see this as like a further reply to Funkenstein, saying that not only that, of course, you made a very, very interesting and valid point by saying, look, medicine is a place in which we find a direct Jewish engagement, which was totally legitimate, but maybe these translations show us a bit more, show us that even in other scientific branches, we can find Jews having interest and kind of translating them and spreading them around their communities.
Yeah, you remember my essay on was it on Figo, where he's giving a sermon, and I figure you at least have read it, where he talks about making things, creating things, and that we are. This is a sermon given on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, which is on a Shabbat, and he can't play the shofar, so he wants us to recall with a memory machine the sound of the shofar in order to, but he's using all of the scientific metaphors, and he's drawing from the outside world and introducing it to his public. So he's not teaching medicine or science in any kind of professional way. He's simply conveying the values of knowing nature and being part of nature and participating in nature and appreciating with reverence and wonder the excitement that the natural world offers, and particularly the new discoveries offer, the new mechanical discoveries. So that kind of material, I think you can find more and more, and it is really relevant in sort of trying to understand the profile of the Jewish leader who is trying to, or the preacher who is trying to convey these kind of values to his kehillah.
Okay. Oh.
Go on. No.
Okay.
I have to be more. Yeah. Okay. I'll stop it. Yeah. Go on.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So by now we were basically discussing translations of science and medicine, but also in Professor Ruderman's work, we know of translations of theological ideas, of stories, like in Yagel's Gei Chizayon, a book that David also translated into English and wrote enlightening footnotes to. And so now we would like to move and to talk about translation, not only as transmission of content between languages, but also between religious spheres, Christian and Jewish, and specifically to talk about the ways theological ideas gets into this net of translation. So Melanie, can you please lead us more in this direction?
Yes, thank you. My question is about genres and missionaries. And as you show in several of your books in early modern and modern Europe, missionaries invested a great deal of energy in providing Christian literature in Jewish languages, Yiddish and Hebrew, for Jews. And in addition, these missionaries intensively studied the characteristics of typical Jewish literary genres, such as Musabicha and rabbinic literature, in order to adapt the Christian message in their texts for Jewish audiences. So my question has to do with the flip side of this kind of Jewish-Christian religious dialogue. As you yourself have discussed, there are cases in which Jewish authors and translators use distinctively Christian genres to address, educate, empower their Jewish readers. Your own work has touched upon Abraham Yagel's use of the genre of the catechism, Lekartov, which I'm very interested in, and also other studies like Rebecca Voss and Avram Siluk, for instance, have revealed the Jewish use of pietist tracts or Protestant prayers by authors like Isaac Wetzler and Aaron Hergershausen. So my question is, would you consider these Jewish adaptations and translations as a reactions or Jewish answer to missionary endeavors? And the second question is, how fluid is the religious identity of literary genres in the world of Jewish translators? You showed in Yagel's Chisayon how Yagel implements and juggles different genres like the novella and the consolatio. So how do you interpret the use of distinctive Christian genres?
Great question, Melanie. And it sounds like, and I really want to hear more about your dissertation some other time. But let's see. Well, I'm certainly not going to talk about Rebecca Voss with her standing here. But I have read most of the stuff that she and Avi have published, and think it is really fantastic. I was taken once to Halle, and I don't know if you've ever been to Halle, but it's such a gold mine of material there. I mean, there's enough work for many Rebecca Vosses and many Avi Salups. Giuseppe Velti once told me that he counted about 600 dissertations on Jewish Christian topics, that just dissertations in the library of Halle. And that's not just pietists, but everything. And it just seems like there's a gold mine there. But so I'm not going to speak about that. I actually was going 3 years ago when we were supposed to have our conference, or 2 years ago, whenever it was. I had a large part of my paper, which I almost wrote. I mean, it was almost in written form. Was to be on Yagel and on the Catechism, which I never addressed fully in my book, and I'm not really sure why. But I did have more to say on it, and I was going to say it then, but I'm going to say some of it now, and maybe I'll either, let me see if I get to give the paper first. But let me talk about Yagel and the issue of missionaries. That's the primary question that you asked. Sure, missionary pressure is in the background, but the story is also a very individual, idiosyncratic story. The key text for me in understanding Yagel is this text, which I actually published even in English translation in one of my readers, from Beit Yar HaLevanon, which is copied from Agrippa, and is a restatement of ancient theology. In other words, starting out with all of the ancient philosophers, and ending with Hermes, who he actually translates a whole sermon, a whole passage from Hermes, a prayer of Hermes, which Hermes recites, which he puts into Hebrew. There's one line in that where he says, you can look pakpake, you can, but if you look at it, it's really the basics. It's the same thing is our Torah Sinai. They're basically saying the same truth. I mean, it's an unbelievable statement of acceptance of the other's faith, and a recognition that Judaism is not so unique after all. Now, I don't know how to take this passage. It's obviously was never published. No one ever saw it, but it's there. And the language is quite amazing for the 16th century. But I think there's something else that's going on. And of course, the nobiliary, the other genres that he uses, they're not just nobiliary, they're Catholic, and they've created their novella around Christian messages. So what he's doing is sort of copying their didactic way of teaching religion through stories. He has no compulsion of using this material. He's not embarrassed by it. In fact, it's extremely natural. Now we come to the Rikach Tov. I guess I didn't write much about it because I wasn't sure if I had anything more to say. But what is critical to me now is the discovery of Federica Francesconi. She, a couple of years ago, discovered in the archives in Modena that a direct evidence that Avram Yagiel was the brother of Camilo Yagiel, the censor. I had been struggling with that question when I was writing the Yagiel book. I remember sitting in the Sifrialdo meet, and every day I would meet Meir Ben Ayahu, to my dismay, and he always had a comment or a question for me. And he would always say to me, Lama ta'oved al Avram Yagiel, goy gamor, itnatzel, lama ta'mevazvez et hazman shelcha. That's what he would say to me. And one day, so I said, how do you know that? And he says, yes, hochacho. So I said, well, can you sit down with me and show me the hochacho? So after bothering him for about 10 times, we sat down together, and he had some 19th century references that speak about Yagiel converting. As those of you that know my Yagiel book, I have an appendix there where I argue that he didn't convert, and there are good reasons why he was a Jew until the day he died. But that's not the point. The point is that his brother converted, and that the brother's son converted, and that they were actively, aggressively part of the church army of censoring books. And that this must have existentially affected him in very deep ways. It reminds me exactly of the story of Yosef HaKohen and his brother, who also converted. And as Reuven Bonfield has shown, particularly in the letters of Yosef HaKohen, there is no question about it that Yosef HaKohen was affected by the conversion of his brother. Avram Yagiel was on the precipice. He was very close. There's something universal, something natural about him. It didn't bother him to make it Jewish, domesticate it. That's the word that I learned after reading so much Elise. To domesticate it in a way that it came out Jewish. And then it was kosher. It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. It didn't bother anybody that it was using Canisius at all. But when you put this together with that passage in the ancient theology, and with the way he proceeds in Gei Chazayon, there is something remarkably different about him. There are other thinkers who are living in two worlds, but he's really expanding that world in a way where he feels comfortable with proclaiming that Judaism and Christianity are very much alike. And it's not such a big deal. Now, is this a rationalization? Is this a response to his brother? Is he almost on the way following his brother? I don't know what the answer is exactly. I can't pinpoint it. I still think he lived and died as a Jew. But nevertheless, the story is remarkably interesting. I have never met an early modern character that comes that close to Christianity without converting, and still proclaims his Jewishness in all kinds of ways. So I think that's the context that I think is relevant in understanding Yagiel. I'd be very curious then to Melanie, to find out how you approach it and how different that is, and whether, I mean, we have Tremelius, but I think that's a different story already. He's converting and so on. And that one guy that wrote on Tremellius, I don't trust his knowledge of the subject too well. We have conversed. I forgot his name. You probably know who I'm talking about. What's his name?
Austin.
Austin. Yeah. He claims, for example, that Farisol was his teacher, and I don't know where he gets that from. I don't have any evidence of that. But in any case, Yagel remains one of the fascinating stories of translation in the early modern period. And while there are parallels, I think he is quite unique as I paint him. And you know, it just shows you how Ruderman always chose weird subjects to work on. That's part of my, you know, my own profile. And Yagel was indeed unusual. So that's as best I can do with that. I know I didn't answer you fully, but maybe we can have another talk some other time.
Thank you.
Okay, so talking about unusual thinkers, I think it's time to discuss Bennett and to hear about your new project. I think we're all waiting for it. Please.
Okay, when Elise introduced it, she put him together with my missionaries. He was a good Jew, so you know, so he was never a missionary nor a convert. Anyway, I appreciate you allowing me to speak about him very briefly. I know this goes beyond the time frame, even though you know, you're almost pushing into the beginning of the 19th century. I can't explain why I got into the 19th century. I can explain why I got into England, because I wanted excuses to work in the British Library, which is the mecca of all libraries for me in the world. I just like to sit there. I feel so good about myself sitting in the library there and meeting people. They used to serve cucumber sandwiches, and they don't do that anymore. But that was in the old British Library. But nevertheless, you meet all these odd English types. You know, if you go into they have coffee there. So anyway, I had to find projects that led me to the British Library, and it's an unbelievable place if you've never really worked there at any length. Oxford is fine, but British Library is special. Anyway, so after finishing this other book, which deals with a English missionary and his anti-Jewish work and a series of responses by Christians and by Jews to this work in the 19th century, I was sort of hanging out in the 19th century some more, and I rediscovered a character I had dealt with in the Jewish Enlightenment book named Solomon Bennett, or Solomon Yom Tov Bennett. I began looking at him. He was an Eastern European Jew who crossed first into Copenhagen, where he studied engraving. He was an artist. How he left Eastern Europe and how he got to Copenhagen and how he managed to get a degree there. And then he went on to Berlin, where he became a relatively famous engraver, winning all kinds of prizes and being a member of the Academy of Kunst in Berlin for 5 years, and then suddenly picking up and leaving and hating Berlin and moving on to London, where he spent the remaining 38 years of his life. He produced a lot of interesting work and a lot of polemics with Christians, but also a lot of polemics with Jews. And I really won't go on. I'm not going to give his biography here. I just want to speak about his translation. He came originally with very little English, and in his first works, he was criticized for his poor English style. The English are very sensitive to bad style. But he obviously got better. And he also became extremely prominent when he had an injury to his eye and ultimately had to leave the engraving field. We have I have some 30 engravings of his, many of them on biblical themes. And particularly a work that he wrote on the Beit HaMikdash of Yechezkel, where he actually engraved plates of how exactly the temple looked in great detail with measurements and so on and so forth. And he did this with other biblical things. I was particularly interested in the space, the artistic dimensions of biblical descriptions and so on. Finally, he decided that he had to that what he could do, the other thing I just wanted to say was that he alienated himself from the Jewish world to a great extent, particularly the rabbi, and the polemics are very important, and I'm not going to really describe them right now. But the way he survived, and barely survived, having about 8 or 9 children, was through writing for non-Jews. So that he became a writer on biblical subjects for non-Jews, to the point where he realized, and he tells us quite interestingly in one of his books, that the editor of Thomas Paine's writing was a friend of his. He has a wide array of English friends, and they range from the most conservative evangelical types to the most radical liberal. It is an unbelievable position for a Jew to be in, to hang out with all of these Christians across the board. But Thomas Paine's editor gives him a copy of Paine. He reads Paine, and he's pained. You'll forgive me to use that word again. He's pained by the notion that this guy can criticize the Old Testament in this way, the text that is common to Jews and Christians. So he decides he's going to translate the Bible into English, where he's going to retranslate the standard version into English for the sake of Christian society. Only a Jew who really knows Hebrew and knows the Meforshim and knows exactly the Masoretic text who can translate it properly. So it comes out with a series of small books, which are sample translations. And then, and I had all of them, and we have a whole long discussion about what he's going to do. But unfortunately, he dies at a young age in 1838. During the pandemic, I discovered that his Bible was extant. The entire, all of his works were in Jews College, which, as you know, was sold by Sotheby's. All of the Hebrew texts were sold. A part of them remain in the Mechon L'Tatzlomei Kitvei Yad, but most of them have disappeared as originals. But because this book was English Hebrew and mostly English, it survived. And it was given over to a yeshiva that took over Jews College, the remnants of Jews College Library. So after 3 years of bothering this woman librarian who didn't want to answer me, I finally got her to look. It wasn't cataloged, and I found the entire Bible. This was about 2 years ago. So what is it? It is the 1834 Oxford edition of the Standard Translation. And what he did was he broke the binding, and after every 2 pages, he puts in blank pages. And on the pages themselves, he crosses out bad translations. And then in the 2 pages that he's put in, he adds his own translations and his own commentaries and his own introductions. So it is a biblical commentary as well. I don't know if there are other examples of this, of a Jew translating the Bible into English for Christians. In other words, this is his role in life. He loves Hebrew. He has spent all of his life correcting the mistranslations of the Christians, wants to set their civilization correct, because this is a wonderful civilization that has treated Jews well. And the only way to do this, to fight off the crazies who are undermining the whole biblical system, is to create a new translation. So what we have is not a new translation. In other words, he accepts, I would say, 60–70% of the standard of King James Version. But he corrects all of the rest, obviously cleaning up any message that looks like it's referring to Christianity. But he goes beyond that. He really thinks they are making mistakes, and he offers his own translation. In the end, he may have produced another work which was totally clean, but there are so many indications on the side of this manuscript, it's 1,600 pages, that send this, put this in there. He apologized for the fact that it's disorganized, but he's doing the best he can. It is a complete text. It is just about, there are a few pages missing, but it's almost complete. It is a magnificent task for a Jew to create a work of this nature. It obviously didn't go anyplace. He couldn't, but 3 years later, one of his, a radical Christian, and this is a guy who talks about a universal religion of all mankind, with the help of the family, publishes his commentary on Bereshit. So we have Bereshit published, in 1841, 3 years after he died. And in fact, it tells us in the text that we are planning to publish his entire translation, of course, which never happened. So here is another very interesting role of a translator. I could go on, but I know I have to stop. But how do you put this? I mean, how do we deal with translations by Jews to other languages in order to save the Christian nation? Is exactly how I see it. Anyway, I just a taste of what I've been working on of late.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to see the complete contemplation about this really interesting and new phenomena. Okay, so we've already been to Italy and to England, but you also wrote very interestingly about Eastern Europe and some engagements with scientific and non-Jewish literature over there. Osnat, would you like to take us to Eastern Europe before we have to finish? Osnat, are you with us?
Yes, sorry. So this is a question about your recent book, a best-selling Hebrew book of the modern era, which is about Pinchas Hurwitz and his Sefer HaBrit. And I'm interested in the concept of the bestseller, and maybe more specifically, I'm interested in thinking of Sefer HaBrit as a book of popular science, or a vehicle for rendering scientific findings and paradigms accessible to wide readership. And I'm curious to know how similar scientific content was made accessible to non-Jewish European readers, and whether Hurwitz was influenced by such works in his style or rhetoric, and how Sefer HaBrit fits into the context of the popular scientific writing of his time. For instance, in terms of the positioning of scientific content within theological content, or even in terms of affecting marketing strategies. So this book is as popular science, I guess.
Do I hear another member of your family in the background?
I've got headphones on, but there is a child here. I tried to move around.
Yeah. No, a boy or a girl?
A boy.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. I'll put myself on mute.
All right. So it's a great question, and I must confess that I don't have a good answer. I would think to me that the works that deal with Musar and science on a popular level must exist within the Christian world, and I should have looked at them. But I was so taken by other issues. The way I wrote this book was, it was given as a series of lectures, as the Strom lectures. I only could pick out certain themes, and as you see, the book is not. It's a book that was based on 4 lectures, so I didn't do. But that's not an excuse. I think I would be very happy if you could find parallels to what Sefer HaBrit is. Now, but I'm sure that the connection is there within the Christian world. But I still was taken by the fact of its Jewish roots. I rely very heavily on the Rezien of La Fontaine, who had looked at the scientific sources of the book. But I was more taken by the fact that what is interesting about this book is that it pretends to be a Perush on Chaim Vital Sha'arei Kedusha. And that, to me, struck it as original and not... I mean, you could say he's just playing games here, but I really think he means it. In fact, I really think he's very much indebted to the connection of Lurianic text between Musar and medicine, Musar, and in other words, that whole Musar literature, which I remember years ago, Yossi Dan made a big deal out of, as being totally uniquely Jewish, and I don't think it was uniquely Jewish at all. Clearly, for example, he translated, or he wrote a commentary on Mishnat Hasidim, on Ricky's work, which was a very important summary of Lurianic Kabbalah. So he was very much aware of that literature and very much indebted to a group of Italian Jewish thinkers. But he was also, Vital for him was also a model. Vital, you recall, especially what we know now from my friend, what's his name, who writes on medicine and Vital, help me out. Asaf, yeah. Vital was a model to him, and so he felt very strongly that introducing the science, which was left out of Sha'arei Kedusha, was absolutely critical. But there are two other things here that make it unique and suggest that indeed there's not a Christian influence going on. Number one is that chapter Ahavat Re'im. I must confess that that chapter blew my mind, and it made me focus on the book directly. I needed that book for my neshama. That chapter, right before, and the other aspect of it is, what is this book about? It's about nevuah. It's about becoming a navi b'dorenu. How do we become a navi? We become a navi by, first of all, studying science, and then doing musar, and then loving Christians. I mean, that's the step after step after step. I know my dear friend Shmuel Feiner loves to call this an Orthodox Jewish book, but I like to see it as a revolutionary book, which either you got or you didn't get, but somehow there was something appealing to you, whether you were Chatam Sofer or whether you were a radical maskil. They all fit together, and somehow they were all tolerated pages. But the book is not just Musar, and it's not just science. It's going in the direction of becoming a Navi. What does exactly that mean? I'm not sure. I never became a Navi myself. I can't tell you. But right before you become a Navi, you have to love everybody. Ahavat Re'im. I mean, and Re'im doesn't mean just Jews. It means everybody. For Pinchas Horowitz. Do we have something like that in the Christian world? I don't think so. We have something like that in the Jewish world in precisely the same way. Sure, I mean, we're moving for statements of tolerance that go right through Mendelssohn and, the same period and so on. But no one says that, you can't be a Navi unless you love humanity. That seems to me, quite striking. I don't know what to make of it. Was he a revolutionary? Was he aware of the import of what he was saying? And did his readers actually pick up the radical nature of that statement? Some did, most didn't. But all of them saw it as a religious book that was striving to complement what Vital had already written. So in that sense, I felt less strongly about the Christian influence, but I think you got to check it out. I didn't complete that part, and I acknowledge that the question is legitimate.
Okay, speaking about things that are incomplete, I'll ask my own question, and I think with it we'll end. Looking back at the many works and topics you and your students have touched upon, and facing the future, I would really like to ask, which topics, corpora, general question, do you see still out of reach for a scholar of early modern Jewish studies? Which stand to you as, in particular, as demanding more attention?
Well, I think I told you already. I mean, you personally, if Yossi Levi never finishes his work, you have to write a monograph on Yashar Mikandia.
I have heard about that later.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. You'll tell me some other time. But that was the only agenda I had for you in particular. But that's the one thinker that is so important that still has not been fully. But I had high hopes with Yossi. Maybe he still will finish. In any case, I just want to use this to say, my own way of proceeding is rather idiosyncratic. I never had a clear agenda other than reading new and exciting new works and new text, and so my own path has been very haphazard. A kind of joyride, pursuing what interested me at the time and following one footnote into another footnote and so on. Unlike other people that have lists of things that they're going to accomplish and so on, I didn't jump. I kind of sort of jumped without thinking about it too much. The only thing that is important to me is good historical writing. And when I see that, it sort of hits me in the face, and it's incredibly satisfying to read and to study and to be stimulated by. The source material still for early modernity is vast, and with all that we've done in the last 20 or 30 years, there is so much more to be done. But as you see, I like to roam, and I wanted to write. I went from Italy to Anglo Jewry to all over the place, and even considering missionaries as Jewish thinkers and or converts, and it's a kind of weird way of approaching things. It could be, as Bonfield always thought, rather galuti, the way I kind of proceeded. I've been asked by Shmuel Feiner and his editors they're having an anniversary volume of Zion, and they've asked me to write the chapter on early modernity, or how Israeli scholarship perceives early modernity, which is going to be an interesting question for me, sort of, sitting in the galut, but very connected to Israel through my background, how I'm going to really formulate that question, and what does that say about Israeli scholarship versus American scholarship? I really don't have any particular agenda in mind. As you know, my interest has always been biographical, and I've now returned again to biography. I began with biography because I felt I could conquer one person better than a whole movement or a whole group of people. And there is something about getting inside a person as much as you can, obviously with the limits of the historical past, and to sort of michaye metim. It is a creative process. Natalie Zeman Davis speaks about it as being giving birth in the womb. I mean, I can't use that metaphor for myself. I don't understand it fully, but I would just use the word mechaye metim. In other words, whatever you do, whatever the material is, bringing it to life, it gives you a certain reverence, a certain awe about the past, and you relive the past through the person you're doing. I mean, even my larger synthetic books are collections of biographies, because I always fall back on the person and the individual life to try to really understand where they're coming from and how they develop and so on and so forth. I really didn't want this, and this almost sounds rabbinic, and I bet this is the first time you ever had anyone trying to be a little sermonic with you coming from the Reform movement. Don't tell your parents this if you're listening to me, but what I want to say, what I really find important, whatever you do, and again, I'm not answering your question because I'm not sure, whatever you do is wonderful. But I would like to see what's critical to me, besides reverence and awe of the past, is also humility. I think our profession, I know it's very humble, particularly in this day and age with the job market, that when you don't have a job, you feel pretty lousy and humble. But I mean humility in the sense of how we write, how we address the past, how we look at our professional ancestors. When that question about, I wasn't pouncing on anybody, but when you were, the question that was asked about, and recent scholarship is talking about, Magdalena's question. But of course, she should have referred first to Reuven Bonfield, and the fact that these are old questions that are being raised again in new ways. Don't forget the 19th century historians. They're fabulous. They have such understanding, but their contexts were different, and they were formulating it quite differently. I think we stand in this kind of shalshelet, and I think it's really very important that we don't see ourselves creating a new agenda, but that we are drawing from the old and reshaping it with our new questions. I think that's exactly what Iris and you guys are doing with translation. It is linked to the past, but you have, and with someone like me, but it is now reformulated in a way that it asks new questions, and it is a history for this era. I must also add that what you are doing in terms of it's another argument for early modernity. It's another argument for suggesting that there is no break between no clear, dramatic break between the past and the present. I'm sure Feiner's not here now, but it is part of that ongoing debate. And it seems to me that it is clear with this particular project and its ramifications that our story is a story of many centuries and is a gradual story and has ramifications in different areas and regions, but there are commonalities that connect it both to the present or to the more recent modern history and also to the past. I just sent it to Iris last night. God Freudenthal just put out a 120-page article on his understanding of translation in the medieval period, which you should take a look at because he has incredible bibliographical references in this article. It just came out in a volume edited by Dimitri Gutas, who is very well known for his work on translation from Greek into Arabic. He was a colleague of mine at Yale years ago. So that the link there to the medieval becomes even more prominent and more interesting. And they have also in their database, or he mentions the number 565 or something, translations from in Provence, Italy, and the medieval base that they have that was collected. Anyway, I'm just wondering now, so I better stop. But, whatever you do, Zilu Gemara. I mean, I just think just write good history. Work very hard on style, on presentation, as well as on content, and correct all the mistakes of the past while acknowledging that you stand on I'm not going to say the shoulders of giants, no, but I'm going to say on the ground of people that prepared the way for you. And anyway, thank you. This was really wonderful for me.
Thank you so much. So with this combination of rigorous thinking and sermonic moments and very useful tips, I think we should end this session. Thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you, Iris, for having the idea and organizing everything. Thank you, Professor Ruderman, for your time and for your very, very interesting thoughts and comments about our questions. Thank you, the JEWTACT team, for those lovely topics of discussion. And we'll see you in the next JEWTACT event. Have a very good night or afternoon, depends where you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, David. That was so exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Magdalena.
Bye.
Send me your article.
I'm sending you the